Well, that's a way to light a fire under my ass, Toby. Last year we got chapters 3 and 4, and ever since then I have been holding on to a video idea that I've written, scrapped, and rewritten about 3 times now. But this year, the gays are winning again, so it's now or never to take this opportunity to share my analysis of chapter 3 and what I think it says about what's coming next for Deltarune. So to start, I feel like the mantle minigame, or the sword route as I've seen most people call it, is way more important than a lot of people give it credit for. Obviously it has a lot of parallels to the weird route, but I think the implications it carries are important to the game and its story as a whole. What I really want to focus on, at least for now, is the scene immediately after you win the ERAM fight. All the mantle sections previous to this have been building up the idea that you, the player, are controlling Kris, who is playing the video game in front of you both. RAM also helps to reinforce this by repeatedly referring to it as a game, specifically the original that Tenna edited for the game show boards. Then the punchline to that setup is to completely break down the walls between us in the fiction we were just presented with. And as it turns out, those walls were so thin to begin with that Kris can just walk right up to collect the shadow mantle from the chest in the TV screen. This scene made a huge impact on me when I first played the chapter, and the message I took away from it was that Mantle was always more than just a game. So with that being said, what else can we take away from that sentiment? Yeah, I've always thought ERAM was the knight, to be honest. It just makes the most sense to me. The knight is very central to how chapter 3 plays out and ends with their reveal, so why would this other shadowy figure from earlier in the chapter just be some other guy? Beyond the Occam's razor part of my argument, I do think there's a lot of depth to be found when you start asking why the mantle minigames are set up as they are, and what purpose that would serve to the Roaring Knight. Specifically, there's a through line in these minigame segments that I find very interesting, and that's the recurring theme of making sacrifices in order to progress. This doesn't really start properly until the second mantle segment, but once I started seeing it, it felt like it was everywhere. Obviously, there's the blue bird that you need the white mage to freeze in order to get past, and then the ice key and the white mage being used up in order to get past the door in the ice dungeon. Then when you collect the shelter key, you see that you are used up. Put a pin in that one, by the way, because we'll be coming back to it. In the third mantle segment, there's the in-game versions of Susie and Ralsei that you have to kill in order to progress to the dungeon, and inside that dungeon itself, all the monsters are reminiscent of the Undertale characters and/or the hometown residents. There is the element of having to kill all the monsters in the previous sections as well, but this one feels more sinister to me with the way it wants you to draw connections between the monsters on screen and the monsters you can talk to in the light world. And the last example that I have comes from DoubleDan's Kris Slash theory. I do recommend that you will go watch the original video on it, but all you really need to understand what I'm getting at here is that the theory posits that in this scene after you defeat the Roaring Knight, it's Kris that takes out Susie and Ralsei rather than the Knight. I've always been a fan of this theory because I do find the evidence of you having to enact the same thing in the mantle minigame beforehand to be really compelling storytelling-wise. And since Kris is knighted directly after this, I think it ties really neatly into the idea that this has all been a test for Kris and the Soul. And this is what I've been leading up to. The process of getting the Shadow Mantle and fighting the Knight was a test that ends with some sort of responsibility or task being passed on to Kris. First, testing in a fictional setting if we're willing to kill monsters, then if we're willing to give ourselves up, then our friends. Then at the end of the game, we're challenged by the Knight in the setting to see if we're worthy of fighting them head on. And finally, at the end of the chapter, should we have passed those trials, we're given our last obstacle, an actual, winnable fight with the Roaring Knight. It's at the end of this fight that I think the Knight has Kris knock down Susie and Ralsei, potentially to keep them from seeing Kris be knighted. Though this theory still works even if you don't buy into kris theory, as Kris still allows the knight to swoon Susie and Ralsei in that case, it does strengthen my ideas, which is why I've chosen to put some focus on it. What exactly has been passed on to Kris here, I don't think we'll find out until Chapter 5, but I am very sure of my prediction there. Besides meaning a cloak or some kind of clothing that sits on your shoulders, a mantle can also be a responsibility or role that is passed from one person to another. Think the phrase, taking up the mantle. And since this is also the point at which we get the third Shadow Crystal, I'm inclined to think that whatever it is will have something to do with the quest to collect all 5. You could argue that the connection I'm making here is flimsy, since in theory you can get the Shadow Mantle and not defeat the knight, or defeat the knight without the mantle if you're good enough at the game, but I think it's clear enough that the intention is for you to collect the mantle for the purpose of defeating the knight, so I think it makes sense here to draw the connection between being knighted and being given a mantle. You also may have been wondering why I said that all of this was a trial for Kris and the soul. I've given plenty of evidence for the Kris side of things, but what about the soul? Glad you asked. It's time to get back to that detail I told you to put a pin in earlier. I didn't notice this until I was collecting screenshots for this video, but yeah, the word you is really not just thrown around in Deltarune. I was always so willing to accept that you in this context meant Kris, because it's Kris playing the game. All the dialogue before and after the ERAM fight is directed at Kris, and it's the Kris sprite that disappears when it says, "You were used up." But even in just the next chapter, we see that other characters are aware of the difference between you and Kris, and some pretty clear symbolism stares us in the face every time we boot up Mantle. So I don't think Kris and the Soul are being tested in the same way here. In fact, it seems to me like the Knight intentionally gamifies the events of Chapter 3 for the Soul. Now, this does get into some meta-narrative territory a little bit, but I think the reason for this is to obscure information from the Soul, while also using us to collect the Shadow Crystals. Kris needs the Soul in order to get the Shadow Crystals since they're all possessed by notably strong opponents, and as such, are all some of the most difficult fights in the game for us as the player. But that acts as a double-edged sword, since they have to give up control of their body to us, so they work with the Knight, and likely Carol as well, to manipulate the Soul's actions as much as possible. And in Chapter 3, this takes the form of the Knight using the TV entertainment theme of the Dark World to encounter us more directly while staying ambiguous and fictional. They use it to taunt us, to encourage us to play out the weird route, and to guide us towards collecting the Shadow Mantle. Admittedly, as sure as I am in my reading of Chapter 3's events, I really couldn't tell you what I think this will ultimately lead to. We still have so many gaps in our understanding of the conspiracy happening in Hometown, around the Roaring Night as a whole, and whatever's going on with the prophecy, so I honestly just don't think we have all the necessary pieces to be able to put anything substantial together quite yet. But with that being said, here are the key takeaways I think we can get out of this. 1. Kris has had some sort of duty passed on to them by the Knight, that we will likely see the consequences of in Chapter 5. And depending on how closely you believe Carol and the Knight to be working together, this could potentially also be what Kris's promise was about. 2. While we don't have enough information to make a solid guess at what exactly has been planned between Kris, the Knight, and Carol, I believe that it will involve Kris collecting all 5 Shadow Crystals. And 3. Kris's fate is inextricably tied with the Soul's, and whenever we are used up, it seems likely that Kris will also be used up alongside us, whatever that ends up meaning for them. Altogether, it doesn't paint a very hopeful picture for Kris's near future in Deltarune, even if that much is evident just from playing the game without any further analysis. Regardless, I still think there's value in reading between the lines and looking into the symbolism of the Mantle minigame like this. It reinforces a lot of ideas that the story has already presented us with, but not explicitly acknowledged yet, such as Kris working with the Knight. And the thing that I'm personally interested in is that it gives us some insight on the personality of the Knight, who we still know so little about. Whoever they may be, we see their dialogue take on a mischievous tone, not quite speaking in riddles, but also not giving us information in an entirely straightforward way either. They act as though they're familiar with Kris in a way that implies they've known each other for a significant amount of time, but also don't hold back when attacking them. It's also very intriguing to me, and I really hope we get to see more of it in Chapter 5. But with that being said, that's all I've got for you for today. If you have any thoughts you'd like to add to the conversation, I would love to hear them in the comments. And if you stuck around to this point, it would be greatly appreciated if you interacted with the video. You can go ahead and find me at my other socials linked in the description, but until next time, thank you and good night.